what you have in cash into this electronic value, this M-Pesa. And right now there's a huge agency network where you have these people who just sit somewhere and they wait for people to come and deposit cash and get electronic funds, or sometimes the reverse. So the agent network really helped onboarding people onto this financial tool.
Right. Lana, I think there are not dissimilar systems in the US. Venmo, for example, which can you talk us through what Venmo does?
Yeah, Venmo is a very interesting system that seems to be widely used among people under 25 and not used by anyone over 25, not even heard of. And it's basically a system where you can send payments to your friends and annotate those payments with little notes, like a little pair of margarita glass emojis, or a note saying, thanks for the good time, or I'm paying for rent, or whatever you'd like. And then you can watch your friends as they pay each other for things and sort of see the way that money and payments map the social network and the social experiences of your friendships. And it's become immensely popular for that reason, because as we sort of scholars of money have long suspected, money is much more than just this, calculating rational economic exchange. It's actually a social transaction that has meaning. The piece that's less exciting for many young people, even those who are using Venmo, is that those annotations and that social grid is also being used for purposes of data collection, for developing new kinds of predictive analytics around fraud, around crime, around advertising, and around a bunch of things that, we're not even really sure what that data will be used for yet. Yes, very profitable.
Let me just bring in David Birch, because he's just handed me his phone, or at least one of his phones probably, and it has a Venmo page on it. So Sarah has paid Ivy, Laura has paid Teresa, Chelsea paid Samantha saying, sorry, I lagged, and a champagne bottle. So I don't know what
it's amazing what people put in. In fact, there's a website you can go to. This greatly adds to the gaiety of the nation, by the way. There's a website you can go to which lists all of the Venmo transactions that involve whatever keywords you put in, and people actually do post.
So do you know all those people, or are they in your friendship
They're people
group?
in my network.
So it depends. The privacy settings.
But that makes it fun to look at those.
It is fun. But the privacy settings by default are open. So if I'm crawling the public API, the public website of Venmo, I can see the transactions of anyone who hasn't changed their privacy settings. I personally use Venmo, and I have set my privacy settings to private, so no one, not even my friends, can see when I transfer money.
Spoils
But I do enjoy looking at it. So there was a website a couple of years ago that crawled this public API for mentions of sex, drugs, and alcohol.
I love that site.
Called Vicemo. I know, it's hilarious. But the scary thing about it is you could see someone saying, oh, I'm paying Dave for margaritas and all kinds of other bad business.
This is for the weed, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, but maybe cash would have been safer.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Not only that, but I can then click and see everything else that Dave is paying for. So I can see that his parents are paying his rent, sending him Venmo, and you can see everything else.
Just wrapping up this first half of the programme, let's start with you, Dave, and we'll come to Brett as well. It seems to me that these systems, they have convenience, and particularly in Kenya, if people haven't got banks, it is going to make their lives significantly easier. But they're not terribly profound. They're just ways of adapting the cash system to make it slightly easier for more people.
Yes, I think the dynamic is that as you move towards a cashless society, as cash becomes purely electronic, then the costs of introducing alternatives begin to fall. If I wanted to try and persuade Waitrose to accept Dave money or whatever, they'd have to install new tills. I mean, it's ludicrous. It wouldn't make any sense. But when you're in an all-electronic world, the idea that I could choose instantaneously to pay with either pounds sterling or air miles or bitcoins or, and actually I probably wouldn't even be bothered to get involved in that. I just let my phone do it because it's boring. I let my phone take care of boring things. So the move towards cashlessness, in one sense, is prosaic. It's just replacing paper with cash. But what it enables, I think, is much more profound. And when Lana mentioned things like Berkshire's, I think that's more of a window into the future than it seems at first glance.
Okay, Brett, just as we wrap up this bit on cashlessness, there's one point I wanted to raise, which is obviously if everything's on record, it gives governments more power to monitor. So there is a privacy issue. But there's also, isn't there, a huge power with government then? Because if everything is electronic and the government switches it off and there's no cash, you'd be in real trouble. I mean, you couldn't even buy your next meal.
Yeah. Can I make a broader point about this? If you really want to understand this debate, you've got to understand the two different ways you can basically create money systems. The cash system is essentially bearer instruments, actual physical representations of money that you carry around. And people often imagine money like this, and you imagine getting rich as accumulating these physical objects. But throughout history, there's always been a second form of money, which is ledger money, which is basically somebody has a database of some sort, whether it's a book or a computer, and they keep score of your monetary tokens for you. And this nowadays is run by the banking system. This is your bank account, essentially. And what you need to run that system is you need a secure way to communicate with whoever controls the ledger. And you need to have a way to identify yourself. And then you ask them to edit these ledgers for you. So when we're talking about the rising cashless society, what we're talking about is removing the physical bearer instrument form of money and replacing it completely with these ledger systems. But the key point about a ledger system is that you have to have an intermediary involved in a ledger system. And the entire fintech industry, or at least a significant proportion of all the innovation, is essentially just building new layers on top of this existing bank payment system. And of course, this now opens up all this potentiality. For example, in a hypothetical scenario where you remove the ability to have cash, you have no option but to use these intermediaries, and that creates a long data trail of almost every single element of your life, which has surveillance potential, but it also has censorship potential. So, for example, imagine a theocratic regime who, in some future scenario, only allows essentially bank payments, or what's called cashless payments, and they decide they don't like certain types of transactions. For example, you will not be able to buy books on
something they don't like.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if we're going to move to these systems, we have to have systems that have privacy built into them. Where I disagree with anarchists like Brett is that privacy and anonymity are not synonymous.
But you can't have privacy. We all know that. Any data can be broken into.
Can I chime in on
Michael,
this? Yeah, I think Brett was talking about the potential of censorship. And I think there's a case that happened recently in Uganda where they had an election a couple of months ago, and a lot of people had mobile money stored up in their phones, but the government just woke up one day and decided to censor this money for about 2 days. People could not take out their money for 2 days. This is exactly what Brett Scott is talking about. Like, if you're going to rely on someone to hold all this money, then there's that risk of something like that happening. And what happened is immediately after the mobile money was released, people went out in droves and just withdrew all their money back into cash. So I think there's a risk here that if you're going to rely on one person with this ledger money, that something like that could happen.
One of the very famous case studies I used in my last book, which is very well known in monetary circles, is the Irish bank strikes of the 1970s, where there were national bank strikes and all money went out of circulation very, very quickly. Within the space of a few days, there was no money in the country. And yet the economy continued perfectly well, because Lana's point about the locality in the next generation of money is well made. What would happen is people would just write each other IOUs, and people who knew everybody, basically pubs, would serve as the clearing houses for the IOUs. Like, if the government takes away the money, you can use some other money.
We do have to take a short break now. You're listening to NewsHour Extra. If you want to email us, it's newshour.extra@bbc.co.uk. Do stay with us as we get slightly more complicated as we think about the future of cash and the future of money. Welcome back to NewsHour Extra. This is Owen Bennett-Jones, and this week we're looking at the future of cash. And we talked in the first half about what happens if coins and notes are eliminated, what are the issues underlying that. But what about the more radical options in the future? Money that isn't backed by any kind of central authority. And just a reminder of our panel, we've got David Birch, Director of Innovation at Consult Hyperion, Brett Scott, author of The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Lana Schwartz, who's an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia, and Michael Kimani, co-founder and CEO of a company in Nairobi that's got Bitcoin technology, and that's the key word now. Brett, can you do that for us? What is Bitcoin? How does it work?
I think the key initial thing to think about Bitcoin is it's a digital currency system that does not rely upon banks in order to exist. So that's sort of point one. I disagree with the idea that Bitcoin is digital cash. The key feature of cash is that it's a bearer instrument. Nobody knows that you hold it. You can pass it from person to person. Bitcoin is much more accurately described as a decentralized version of the existing bank payment system. So it's a decentralized ledger money system as opposed to a centralized ledger money system that the banks run. And the key thing about a ledger money system is it involves people sending messages to whoever controls the ledger, asking them to edit the ledger. In the bank payment system, you send messages to your bank asking them to do that. In the Bitcoin system, you send messages to the network asking them to change a ledger called the blockchain.
I thought the big significant thing about it was not so much that it cut the banks out, although that's a big deal, but that it cut the central banks out. And so there was no government control of the currency.
Well, you can't separate commercial banks from central banks. I mean, the monetary system is a combination of actions by the central bank that are then amplified by the commercial banks. They're all part of one unified system.
Okay. And Michael Kamani, so how profound, in your view, is Bitcoin? We've been talking about debit cards and this system you've got on mobile phones in Kenya. How much does Bitcoin take us into new territory?
I think from Bitcoin, because it's a digital currency and it's peer-to-peer, some of the things I'm observing here is people are using it for global commerce, because what I was describing with M-Pesa is when you're at home and you want to send money to your aunt who's 500 kilometers away, you don't really have to leave where you are. And Bitcoin is also enabling this, where you can sit on your couch and send value across the world to anyone. And this is where I can see the early adopters here are picking up on it, where they're using Bitcoin to bridge the gap between their country and traders or people providing services somewhere else in the world. So I think that has huge implications, because it's connecting two people directly, and they can do a transaction like they would anywhere else without having to go through anyone. I think that's a really big thing.
Dave Birch has just disappointed me. I heard him unzipping his sack, and I thought he was going to get a Bitcoin out. But you didn't. You just got your phone charger. Right?
I do have some Bitcoins on my phone. So
I think it's important to note that you cannot actually hold Bitcoin on your phone. All you can do is control an account on a global ledger from your phone. That's all you actually have. So this idea that you somehow can pass money from one computer to another is erroneous. The key thing, what you're doing, is that there is a single large record of who has what, and you get access via these devices. And that's like the key thing to talk about.
And Lana, yes, can you come in? I know one of your points is that it's become a commodity rather than a currency. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so I do want to say that, I mean, Bitcoin has been tremendously fecund for the imagination of so many different people who are trying to rethink and reimagine money, and there are lots of ways to define it, and that way is shifting. But contrary to, I want to just kind of push back on Brett's pushing back on the definition of it not being a digital cash, and point out that the original white paper that launched the Bitcoin project was called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And in the beginning, at least according to my research and my observations, many of the earliest adopters, when the Bitcoin community was very small, were interested in creating a mutually produced, which means everyone chips in just a little bit, shared infrastructure to send private, secure messages, and those messages would contain monetary value. And the way they did that, as Brett correctly pointed out, was to have everyone's computer host a version of this shared ledger, this single ledger. And so when I would say, send one Bitcoin to Brett, I would write to the ledger saying Lana's Bitcoin goes to Brett, and that would all be pseudonymous, and it wouldn't actually be my computer saying that exactly. It would be all of the computers agreeing on the same version of that ledger. But the important thing, it's very easy to get lost in the mystification of Bitcoin and blockchain as this difficult and arcane technological system. But the point, as I see it, is that originally it was imagined by some as a way of having a shared, voluntarily produced infrastructure for sending private payments. What has happened and what has driven so much of the attention to Bitcoin is how much those individual quote-unquote Bitcoins are worth. The